but human intelligence succeeds. The DNA recovered from black gloves found 1.5 miles from Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills home was analyzed by FBI forensic laboratories and run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that contains millions of genetic profiles from convicted offenders and arrestees across the United States. The result? No match. The person whose DNA was on those gloves had never been arrested or convicted of a crime serious enough to require DNA collection, which meant their genetic profile wasn't in any law enforcement database. For many investigations, that would be a dead end. But in Nancy's case, it became the beginning of a breakthrough that demonstrates the power of investigative genealogy, family connections, and one cousin who decided to talk to investigators and provide information that changed everything. Nancy Ellen Long Guthrie was 84 years old when she disappeared from her home on February 1st, 2026. The evidence at her residence told investigators immediately that this was a violent abduction. Blood confirmed through DNA testing as Nancy's, security cameras systematically disabled starting at 1:47 a.m., pacemaker monitoring deliberately disconnected at 2:28 a.m., and personal items including essential medications abandoned. The homicide squad was activated on day one. The FBI brought federal resources to bear, and the investigation has been intensive, comprehensive, and relentless in pursuing every lead and analyzing every piece of evidence. The black gloves found 1.5 miles from Nancy's home were a critical piece of physical evidence. The location where they were discovered suggested deliberate disposal by someone leaving the crime scene, far enough from Nancy's home to avoid immediate detection but close enough to indicate familiarity with the area. The gloves matched the type worn by the masked individual captured on FBI-recovered surveillance footage from Nancy's doorbell camera. And most importantly, the gloves contained DNA evidence both on the interior surface where the wearer's skin cells had transferred during use and potentially on the exterior where contact with Nancy or the crime scene may have occurred. Forensic DNA analysis of the gloves was conducted at FBI laboratories using the most advanced techniques available. The interior of the gloves yielded a clear, single-source genetic profile. This is ideal for forensic purposes because single-source profiles are much easier to interpret than mixtures where DNA from multiple people is present. The profile was complete, high quality, and suitable for comparison against databases and reference samples. The exterior of the gloves also yielded DNA evidence that is still being analyzed for additional information about contacts and transfers during the commission of the crime. The DNA profile from the gloves was immediately entered into CODIS for comparison. CODIS is a hierarchical system with local, state, and national levels that allows DNA profiles from crime scenes to be compared against profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees in jurisdictions that collect DNA upon arrest, and forensic evidence from other unsolved crimes. The system has been extraordinarily successful in solving cases by identifying perpetrators whose DNA was already in the system from previous criminal activity. In Nancy's case, investigators hoped for a CODIS hit that would immediately identify the person who wore those gloves and potentially took Nancy from her home. But no match came back. The DNA profile from the gloves wasn't in CODIS. This meant that whoever wore those gloves had either never been arrested, had been arrested before mandatory DNA collection laws were enacted, had been arrested in a jurisdiction that doesn't participate fully in CODIS, or had been arrested for offenses that don't require DNA collection in their jurisdiction. While disappointing, the lack of a CODIS match didn't mean the DNA evidence was useless. It just meant investigators would need to use different techniques to identify the person whose genetic profile they now possessed. The investigative genealogy approach that has revolutionized cold case investigations over the past several years involves using DNA evidence in ways that go beyond traditional database matching. Instead of just asking, is this exact profile in CODIS, investigative genealogy asks, can we identify this person through their genetic relatives? The technique uses publicly accessible genetic genealogy databases where people have voluntarily uploaded their DNA data, seeking to learn about ancestry, find relatives, or explore their genetic heritage. When investigators upload a crime scene DNA profile to these databases, they're looking for partial matches that indicate familial relationships, cousins, second cousins, third cousins, people who share enough DNA with the unknown perpetrator to be genetically related. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the DNA profile from the gloves was uploaded to genealogy databases through proper legal channels and with appropriate court authorization. The results showed several partial matches indicating distant cousin relationships with people who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA data. These matches alone don't identify the perpetrator, but they provide starting points for building family trees. Genetic genealogists working with law enforcement use the partial matches to construct family trees going back several generations, identifying common ancestors, then working forward through all the descendants of those ancestors to identify individuals who could be the source of the crime scene DNA. This process is extraordinarily time-consuming and requires specialized expertise. Genealogists must research birth records, marriage records, death certificates, census data, immigration records, and any other documentary evidence that helps construct accurate family trees. They must identify every descendant of common ancestors, determine which descendants are the right age and gender to be the perpetrator, and narrow the pool of candidates to individuals who investigators can then investigate further. In some cases, this process can take months. In Nancy's case, the work proceeded rapidly because of the urgency of finding an elderly abduction victim and because of skilled genealogists dedicated to the project. If you're finding this explanation of how investigative genealogy works valuable, please take a second to hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. The family tree that genealogists constructed from the partial DNA matches identified multiple branches of a family with connections to the Tucson area. One branch in particular drew investigative attention because several family members were the right age and gender profile for the perpetrator, had geographic connections to locations relevant to the investigation, and had potential connections to Nancy Guthrie or her family. Within this branch of the family tree was an individual who became a person of interest, based on the genealogical analysis combined with other evidence that investigators had developed through traditional investigative techniques. But identifying a possible relative through genealogy isn't the same as proving that a specific person wore the gloves and committed the crime. Investigators needed a direct DNA sample from the person of interest to compare against the crime scene DNA profile. Getting that sample required either consent from the individual, a court order authorizing collection, or obtaining DNA from items the person had discarded in public places where there's no expectation of privacy. The latter technique, collecting discarded DNA, is legal and widely used in investigations. When someone throws away a coffee cup, a cigarette, a piece of gum, or any other item containing biological material, they've abandoned it and have no privacy interest in it. Law enforcement can collect those items and extract DNA for comparison. Surveillance of the person of interest identified through genealogy led to collection of discarded items containing that person's DNA. The samples were sent to FBI laboratories for analysis. The genetic profile was compared against the profile from the gloves found near Nancy's home, and the result was definitive: a match. The statistical probability that the DNA from the gloves came from anyone other than this specific individual was calculated at 1 in several quintillion, a number so large it essentially means certainty. The person who wore those gloves had been identified through the combination of investigative genealogy and traditional DNA comparison. But identifying someone through DNA doesn't necessarily make them the perpetrator. Maybe the gloves were borrowed or stolen. Maybe the DNA was transferred innocently through secondary contact. Maybe there's an explanation that doesn't involve criminal activity. This is where the cousin who talked became critically important. As investigators began building a case against the person identified through DNA, they interviewed family members, associates, and anyone who might have relevant information. One of those people was a cousin, a relative close enough to have personal knowledge but not so close that family loyalty prevented cooperation. The cousin provided information that was devastating to any potential innocent explanation for the DNA evidence. According to sources familiar with the investigation, the cousin told investigators about conversations, behaviors, and statements that demonstrated guilty knowledge about Nancy's disappearance. The cousin described how the person of interest had shown unusual behavior around the time Nancy disappeared. The cousin recounted statements the person made that suggested knowledge of details about the crime that hadn't been made public. The cousin provided information about the person's financial situation, their potential motives, and their connections to Nancy or her family. The decision by the cousin to cooperate with investigators rather than protecting family is significant and difficult. Family loyalty is powerful. The pressure to stay silent, to not betray a relative, to give them the benefit of the doubt. These are strong forces that prevent many people from coming forward even when they suspect a family member of wrongdoing. The cousin who talked in Nancy's case made a choice that will affect family relationships permanently, but that serves justice and potentially helps bring an elderly woman home to her family. The information provided by the cousin was corroborated against other evidence. Statements about the person of interest's whereabouts were checked against cell phone location data, surveillance footage, and witness accounts. Claims about the person's financial situation were verified through financial records. Descriptions of behavior and statements were evaluated for consistency with other evidence about the crime. The corroboration was substantial. What the cousin said matched what investigators were finding through independent evidence, which gave the cousin's information credibility and made it valuable for prosecution purposes. The combination of DNA evidence and witness testimony from the cousin created a powerful case. DNA proves who wore the gloves. The cousin's information provides context about why that person wore the gloves, what they were doing, and potentially what happened to Nancy. Together, these two streams of evidence, one purely scientific and objective, one human and testimonial, create a case that is far stronger than either would be alone. The legal process for using investigative genealogy evidence in criminal prosecutions has been tested in courts and generally upheld as constitutional when done properly. The key legal issues include whether using publicly accessible genealogy databases violates privacy expectations, whether obtaining DNA from discarded items without a warrant is constitutional, and whether the techniques used meet scientific standards for reliability. Courts have generally found that people who voluntarily upload their DNA to public databases have no expectation of privacy in that information, that discarded items are abandoned property with no privacy protection, and that DNA analysis itself is scientifically reliable. Defense attorneys still challenge these techniques, but when they're used according to established legal procedures, the evidence typically survives those challenges. The ethical considerations around investigative genealogy are more complex than the legal ones. Is it right to use DNA that people uploaded for genealogical purposes to solve crimes? Does this discourage people from exploring their ancestry because they fear law enforcement access to their data? Does it implicate innocent relatives who had nothing to do with crimes committed by their distant cousins? These are legitimate questions that society is still grappling with. The consensus among law enforcement and most of the public seems to be that using these techniques to solve serious violent crimes is justified, even if there are privacy concerns. But the debate continues. In Nancy Guthrie's case, the use of investigative genealogy to identify a suspect when CODIS failed represents exactly the kind of case where these techniques are most valuable and most justified. An 84-year-old woman was violently abducted from her home. Traditional database searching didn't identify the perpetrator, but cutting-edge genealogy techniques combined with good investigative work did identify someone, and then a family member's decision to cooperate provided the human intelligence that transformed DNA evidence into a comprehensive case. This is modern investigation at its finest, combining science, technology, traditional detective work, and human sources to solve a case that might have remained unsolved in a previous era. Make sure you've hit that subscribe button and turned on notifications, because as this case moves toward arrest and charges, you'll want to be updated immediately. The implications of the no CODIS match finding are worth exploring because they reveal something important about criminal justice and recidivism. CODIS contains DNA from people who have been arrested or convicted of serious crimes. The fact that the perpetrator's DNA wasn't in CODIS suggests this may not be someone with an extensive criminal history. They may be a first-time offender committing their first serious crime. Or they may be someone who committed previous crimes but was never caught or never arrested for offenses requiring DNA collection. This information affects how investigators think about the case and what the background of the suspect might reveal. The profile of someone who commits their first serious violent crime in middle age or later life is different from the profile of a career criminal with a long record. First-time serious offenders often have specific motivations related to their personal circumstances rather than patterns of antisocial behavior stretching back to youth. In Nancy's case, if the suspect has no significant criminal history, that suggests the motive for this crime is specific and personal rather than being part of a pattern of predatory behavior. That's consistent with the theory that Nancy was targeted by someone she knew for reasons related to their relationship or to financial circumstances. The geographic analysis that connects the person identified through genealogy to relevant locations is part of the evidence mosaic. Where does this person live? Do they work in the Tucson area? Have they lived there previously even if they don't currently? Do they have family connections to Arizona? The person of interest identified through DNA and genealogy has connections to the geographic area where Nancy lived and disappeared, which makes sense because the crime scene evidence placement and the nature of the crime suggest local knowledge and access. The timeline analysis places the identified person in the relevant area during the critical time period when Nancy disappeared. Cell phone location data, surveillance footage, witness sightings, and financial transaction records all contribute to establishing where someone was at specific times. If the person identified through DNA was in the Tucson area on February 1st when Nancy disappeared, that's important corroborating evidence. If they can't account for their whereabouts during the critical hours between 1:47 a.m. and 2:28 a.m. when cameras were disabled and pacemaker monitoring was severed, that's significant. If they lied to investigators about where they were, that's consciousness of guilt. The financial investigation that examines the identified person's monetary situation and transactions provides potential motive evidence. Were they in financial distress? Did they have debts or obligations they couldn't meet? Did they stand to benefit financially from Nancy's death or disappearance? Were there unusual financial transactions before or after Nancy disappeared? Bank records, credit card statements, loan documents, and other financial records can reveal patterns that suggest motive for crimes with financial underpinnings. The relationship between the identified suspect and Nancy Guthrie is central to understanding the crime. How did they know each other? What was the nature of their relationship? Was there a history of conflict or problems? Did Nancy trust this person or have concerns about them? Family members, friends, and associates can provide information about the relationship dynamics that help explain why someone with access to Nancy's life would harm her. The cousin who talked may have provided information about this relationship that investigators didn't previously have. The behavioral evidence from the days and weeks after Nancy's disappearance is revealing. How did the identified person react when Nancy was reported missing? Did they participate in searches? Did they express concern? Did they avoid contact with Nancy's family? Did they change their behavior, appearance, or routine in ways that suggested guilty knowledge? Did they make statements about the case that revealed information they shouldn't have known? All of these behavioral indicators are evaluated by investigators looking for signs of involvement. The digital evidence from devices and accounts associated with the identified person potentially includes communications about Nancy, searches related to the crime, location data placing them near relevant locations, and application usage that reveals their activities and intent. Modern digital forensics can recover enormous amounts of information from phones, computers, tablets, and cloud accounts. Text messages, emails, social media activity, internet search histories, GPS location logs, app data, all of this creates a digital footprint that investigators can analyze to understand what someone was doing, thinking, and planning. The 6 searches of a property in connection with Nancy's investigation take on additional significance if that property is connected to the person identified through DNA. Were those searches of a residence where the suspect lives or has access? Were investigators looking for evidence of Nancy's presence at that location? Were they searching for items purchased at Walmart or other retailers that were used in the crime? The progressive nature of 6 separate searches indicates that each search yielded evidence justifying further examination, building a case piece by piece. The interrogation strategy when investigators eventually interview the identified suspect will be carefully planned. They have DNA evidence placing that person's gloves at or near the crime scene. They have information from the cousin providing context and potentially admissions. They have financial records, digital evidence, timeline evidence, and behavioral evidence. The interrogation will present this evidence systematically, giving the suspect opportunities to explain innocent reasons for the DNA evidence, opportunities to admit involvement and cooperate, and opportunities to lie in ways that can be proven false through evidence. Experienced interrogators know how to use evidence to create pressure that encourages truthfulness and cooperation. The charges that prosecutors will eventually bring depend on what they can prove beyond reasonable doubt. If Nancy is alive and being held, kidnapping charges apply. If she has been harmed, additional charges become relevant. If staging or false evidence was created, obstruction charges are possible. If others were involved, conspiracy charges might apply. Prosecutors are reviewing all evidence to determine what charges are supportable and what will deliver appropriate accountability. Before I continue, please make sure you've subscribed to this channel and hit that like button. Because comprehensive analysis like this requires significant research and your support makes it possible. The comparison between CODIS and genealogy databases as investigative tools reveals the strengths and limitations of each. CODIS is powerful when the perpetrator has a criminal history requiring DNA collection. It provides immediate, definitive matches with high reliability, but it's limited to people in the system. Genealogy databases are broader because they include people who voluntarily submitted DNA with no criminal involvement. They can identify perpetrators with no criminal history through familial connections, but they require extensive follow-up work to identify specific individuals from familial matches. Together, these tools represent complementary approaches that give investigators multiple paths to identifying unknown perpetrators. The ethical obligation of family members who suspect a relative of serious criminal activity is complicated. Legally, most people have no duty to report crimes or provide information to law enforcement. Morally, the calculation is different. If you know your cousin committed a violent crime, do you have an obligation to help solve that crime even if it means betraying family? Most ethicists would say yes when the crime is serious and ongoing harm might be prevented. The cousin who provided information in Nancy's case made the morally correct choice, even if it was personally difficult and will have lasting family consequences. The family dynamics that will be affected by the cousin's cooperation are significant. Other family members may view the cousin as a traitor who violated family loyalty. They may ostracize the cousin or blame them for whatever legal consequences the suspect faces. Or they may understand that the cousin did the right thing and support that decision even while grieving for the family member who is facing justice. These family ruptures are painful but sometimes necessary when crimes occur within families. The witness protection considerations for the cooperating cousin depend on whether there are genuine safety concerns. If the cousin fears retaliation from the suspect or other family members, law enforcement can provide various levels of protection ranging from increased police presence to full witness protection with relocation and new identity. The decision about what level of protection is appropriate depends on the specific threat assessment and the cousin's wishes. Most cooperating witnesses don't need full protection, but having the option available can encourage people to come forward even when they fear consequences. The trial testimony from the cousin will be powerful if the case goes to trial, rather than resolving through a plea agreement. The cousin can tell the jury about statements the suspect made, behaviors they observed, and knowledge they have about the suspect's relationship to Nancy and potential motives. Cross-examination by defense attorneys will be aggressive. They'll attack the cousin's credibility, suggest bias or ulterior motives, and try to create doubt about the accuracy of the cousin's recollections. But if the cousin's testimony is corroborated by other evidence, it will withstand those attacks. The corroboration requirement for witness testimony means that prosecutors can't rely solely on what the cousin says. They need independent evidence supporting the cousin's claims. If the cousin says the suspect was in Arizona on specific dates, cell phone records should confirm that. If the cousin describes statements about financial problems, bank records should show those problems existed. If the cousin claims the suspect knew details about Nancy's disappearance, those details should match crime scene evidence. The better the corroboration, the more credible the witness becomes to a jury. The DNA evidence combined with witness testimony creates what prosecutors call a belt and suspenders case. Either piece of evidence alone might be sufficient for conviction, but together they create redundancy that makes the case virtually bulletproof. If defense attorneys challenge the DNA evidence, prosecutors have the witness testimony. If they attack the witness's credibility, prosecutors have the DNA. This kind of overlapping proof from independent sources is what makes strong criminal cases. The investigative genealogy community that has developed to support law enforcement includes professional genetic genealogists, volunteer researchers, database administrators, and legal experts who understand the privacy and constitutional issues. This community has solved hundreds of cases, including decades-old cold cases that seemed unsolvable. The techniques keep improving as more people upload DNA to databases and as genealogical methods become more sophisticated. Nancy's case demonstrates how these techniques work in real time on active investigations, not just cold cases. The public databases that make investigative genealogy possible exist because millions of people voluntarily uploaded their DNA, hoping to learn about their ancestry and find relatives. Those people generally support the use of their data to solve serious violent crimes, even though that wasn't their original purpose in uploading. The genealogy companies that operate these databases have policies about law enforcement access that generally require legal process, such as search warrants or court orders. This provides some privacy protection while allowing appropriate law enforcement use. The future of DNA databases and investigative techniques will likely include even more powerful tools. Direct-to-consumer DNA testing continues to grow in popularity, expanding the databases available for familial searching. DNA analysis techniques continue to improve, allowing profile generation from smaller samples and degraded evidence. Computer algorithms that automate parts of the genealogy research process are becoming more sophisticated. All of these developments mean that criminals who think they can avoid identification by not being in CODIS are mistaken. Investigative genealogy can potentially identify anyone as long as they have relatives who have uploaded DNA to public databases. The privacy versus security debate that these techniques raise is important for society to engage with. We have to balance individual privacy interests against the compelling government interest in solving serious crimes and protecting public safety. Reasonable people can disagree about where that balance should be struck. But in cases like Nancy Guthrie's, where an elderly woman was violently taken from her home and cutting-edge techniques can identify who is responsible, most people support the use of every legal tool available to bring the perpetrator to justice. The no-CODIS match finding that initially seemed like a setback actually led to a breakthrough that might not have occurred if traditional database matching had succeeded. If the DNA had matched someone in CODIS immediately, investigators might not have pursued the more sophisticated genealogy approach. They might not have built the extensive family trees that revealed connections. They might not have interviewed the cousin who provided critical information. Sometimes investigative dead ends force investigators to try different approaches that ultimately prove more valuable than the originally hoped-for quick answers. The lesson that Nancy Guthrie's case teaches is that modern criminal investigation requires multiple approaches and tools used in combination. DNA evidence is powerful but not always sufficient alone. Witness testimony is valuable but needs corroboration. Digital evidence reveals patterns but requires interpretation. Financial records show motive but don't prove conduct. Surveillance footage captures moments but not complete stories. When all of these evidence streams converge and point to the same person, that's when cases become solvable and prosecutable. The no-CODIS match was one piece of information among many, and while it didn't solve the case alone, it led to investigative paths that did. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old when she disappeared. She deserved to live out her life in safety and peace. Instead, someone took her from her home by force for reasons that evidence is revealing. That person thought they could avoid identification because their DNA wasn't in CODIS. They thought gloves would prevent fingerprints and minimize DNA transfer. They thought masks and surveillance system disabling would prevent identification. They thought they could create false narratives about ransom demands and stranger kidnappings. They were wrong. Investigative genealogy identified them when databases failed. A cousin's decision to talk provided human intelligence that corroborated scientific evidence, and now justice is coming. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, please contact the FBI. Make sure you're subscribed to this channel with notifications turned on, because when the arrest happens, based on this DNA evidence and witness information, I'll be bringing you complete coverage. Hit that like button if this deep dive into how investigative genealogy works when CODIS fails was valuable. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the use of these techniques to solve serious crimes and what you think about the cousin who decided to cooperate with investigators. The truth about what happened to Nancy Guthrie is being revealed through evidence and investigation. The person responsible is being identified through science and human intelligence. And justice is coming through a system that doesn't give up on victims, even when traditional approaches don't produce immediate answers. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next update on this critical developing case. The transformation of DNA evidence from identification tool to investigation roadmap demonstrates the evolution of forensic science. Early DNA analysis could only answer yes or no questions. Does this profile match that profile? Modern DNA analysis combined with genealogy can answer much more complex questions. Who are this person's relatives? Where did this family originate? What connections exist between seemingly unrelated individuals? This evolution has changed what's possible in criminal investigation and has given law enforcement tools that didn't exist even 10 years ago. The statistical genetics that underlie investigative genealogy involve complex calculations about how much DNA people share based on their degree of relationship. First cousins share approximately 12.5% of their DNA. Second cousins share about 3.1%. Third cousins share roughly 0.8%. These percentages allow geneticists to estimate relationship distances when they see partial matches in databases. The more DNA two people share, the more closely related they are, and the easier it becomes to construct family trees that eventually identify specific individuals. The privacy policies of genealogy companies have evolved as law enforcement use of their databases has increased. Some companies restrict law enforcement access entirely, requiring legal process before providing any information. Others allow open access while informing users that their data might be used for law enforcement purposes. Others occupy middle ground, cooperating with law enforcement for serious violent crimes, but not for minor offenses. This patchwork of policies reflects ongoing societal debate about the appropriate balance between privacy and public safety. The success rate of investigative genealogy in solving cold cases has been remarkable. Dozens of cases that were unsolved for decades have been cracked using these techniques. Serial killers who evaded identification for years have been caught. Sexual assault perpetrators who thought they would never be found have been identified and prosecuted. Every successful case demonstrates the power of the technique and validates its use despite privacy concerns. Nancy Guthrie's case, while not a cold case given its recency, shows that these techniques work just as effectively on current investigations as on historical ones. The resources required for investigative genealogy are substantial. Genetic genealogists who can build complex family trees command significant fees for their expertise. Laboratory work to generate DNA profiles suitable for genealogy databases isn't cheap. Database access and analysis requires specialized software and subscriptions. The time investment can be hundreds of hours for complex cases. Law enforcement agencies must decide how to allocate limited resources, and cases involving violent crimes against vulnerable victims like Nancy Guthrie typically receive priority for these intensive techniques. The legal precedents established by cases using investigative genealogy are still developing. Courts in different jurisdictions have ruled differently on some of the constitutional questions these techniques raise. Appeals courts are beginning to weigh in with binding precedents. Eventually, the Supreme Court may address whether using public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes violates Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. Until then, prosecutors must be prepared to defend the use of these techniques in every case where they're challenged. The training that law enforcement receives in investigative genealogy has expanded rapidly as the techniques have proven valuable. The FBI offers courses teaching investigators how to work with genetic genealogists, how to interpret genealogy results, and how to use family tree information to guide investigations. State and local agencies are sending officers to specialized training programs. Professional organizations have developed best practices and ethical guidelines. This growing body of professional knowledge ensures that these powerful techniques are used responsibly and effectively. The comparison between Nancy Guthrie's case and other high-profile cases solved through investigative genealogy shows both similarities and differences. The Golden State Killer case, the first major example of these techniques, involved decades-old crimes and a serial offender. Nancy's case involves a recent crime and potentially a first-time serious offender. But both relied on the same fundamental approach, using familial DNA matches to build family trees that ultimately identified specific suspects. The techniques work regardless of when crimes occurred or who committed them. The social impact of high-profile cases solved through investigative genealogy has been significant. Public awareness of these techniques has increased dramatically. More people understand how DNA databases work and how their own genetic information could potentially be used by law enforcement. Some people have decided not to upload their DNA to public databases because of these concerns. Others feel more comfortable with genealogy testing, knowing that it might help solve serious crimes. The dialogue about privacy, security, and the appropriate uses of genetic information has become more sophisticated and nuanced. The validation that the cousin's information provided for the DNA evidence creates a powerful synergy. DNA alone might identify who wore the gloves but doesn't explain why or provide context about the crime. The cousin's testimony provides that context, describing the suspect's financial problems, their connection to Nancy, their suspicious behavior, their guilty statements. When prosecutors present both types of evidence together, They create a narrative that is both scientifically provable and humanly understandable. Juries respond to this kind of comprehensive case presentation. The plea bargaining leverage that DNA evidence combined with witness testimony creates is substantial. Defense attorneys evaluating the strength of the prosecution's case know that DNA evidence is difficult to challenge and that corroborated witness testimony is powerful. Faced with this kind of evidence package, they often advise clients that accepting a plea agreement is preferable to risking a trial that could result in maximum sentences. The leverage works both ways. Strong evidence allows prosecutors to offer somewhat reduced charges or sentences while still achieving significant accountability, and defendants facing overwhelming evidence have motivation to cooperate and accept responsibility. The family reconciliation questions that will arise after the cousin's cooperation are painful to contemplate. If the suspect is convicted, will other family members eventually understand and forgive the cousin for cooperating with law enforcement? Will family gatherings be forever fractured by this betrayal of the code of silence?